Okay, so what came after prehistory? Obviously, history starts, and we start history in the ancient age. But what was it? So, like I said, it's the first period of history, but why? Okay, we're going to look at that a bit more in detail later, but the basic answer is people invented writing, very early forms of writing, which we don't really use anymore. But people invented writing, and history is the study of what we have written about the past. It's writing. So when writing is invented, history begins. Now, the ancient age, or the Bronze Age, is broken up into two main periods: the early Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age, basically. Now, why the Bronze Age? It's because people stopped using stone tools, so the Stone Age ended. And the replacement originally was a metal called copper, but copper is very weak and not very resilient. It doesn't last very long, bends very easily. So people moved to a different metal, bronze, and bronze is made by mixing copper and another metal called tin. And these civilizations are called Bronze Age civilizations because they used bronze. The civilizations that we're going to talk about now, they developed out of the Neolithic revolution that we talked about in the last unit. So when farming was developed, people settled down and societies developed. And these civilizations began at that point, basically. But they become known as the Bronze Age civilizations when they invent writing and when they start using bronze. Okay, but they did exist before. So the first one to develop was Sumer, okay, or ancient Sumeria. And this is here in the orange on the map. Okay, so this is in an area called Mesopotamia, which is the valley between two rivers. So you've got the river Tigris and the river Euphrates there. And this whole region here is known as the Fertile Crescent. We learned about it in our classes on the Neolithic Revolution. And at the southern end of those rivers, this civilization developed. Now, this was not a unified civilization. It was lots of different independent cities. So I have marked on the map here Ur, Uruk, and Lagash. They were three of the biggest cities, but there were a lot more. And they weren't unified. Each city was independent of all of the others, and they regularly fought with each other. There was periods when one city was more powerful than the others, and periods when another city was more powerful. They were the first real civilization in the world, the first people to use proper writing, except for accounting. And they came into existence more or less around 4000 BCE. And the reason that they are marked orange and green is because they were taken over by Acadia. And Acadia is the first real empire of the world. They emerged around 2300 BC with the famous king Sargon the Great. And the reason they're considered the first empire is that they conquered all of this land. Their capital was Akkad here, but they conquered all of this land in green, including pretty much all of ancient Sumeria. And because they conquered and administered foreign lands, they're considered an empire. We're going to look at the Akkadians more closely in class. We're going to examine some artifacts and some sources about the Akkadians to see what we can learn about them. So I won't go into too much detail right now. And then lastly, for this map, around the same time, here in blue, we can see Old Kingdom Egypt. This was the first golden age of Egypt. Egypt is typically divided into three golden ages: the old, middle, and new kingdoms. And the Old Kingdom was the first. After Egypt was unified, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were originally two separate kingdoms. They were unified about 3100 BC. And by 2600 BCE, the pharaohs, the kings of Egypt, had pretty solid control over the Nile River, as far south as you can see on the map. There, okay? And they had two principal cities, Memphis the capital of Lower Egypt, which is higher up on the map because it's further north, but it's Lower Egypt because it's further down on the river's path, and Thebes, the capital of Upper Egypt. Now, when the Egyptian pharaohs established this solid control over their kingdom, they were able to implement very effective rule, which meant that Egypt was able to take on large construction works. Previously, they wouldn't have been able to organize something like this, but this was the period that the Great Pyramids were built, the Sphinx was built, and many great temples were built in several of the cities, not just Memphis and Thebes. And they were also able to establish vast trade networks across the Mediterranean, through obviously the oceans at the mouth of the Nile, or the ports at the mouth of the Nile, and upriver with other peoples in Africa. Now, following on from that, Egypt conquered a lot of territory. They conquered along the coast to the west. They conquered further up the river, further south, and they conquered up the coast of the Levant, including cities like Tyre, and up Canaan. This is when the Israelites from the Bible were conquered by the Egyptians, and they were brought to work on the monuments in Egypt. And later, famously, Moses led them out. Probably the most famous ruler from this period is Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great. He was actually one of the last effective rulers of Egypt before the so-called Bronze Age collapse, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, if we look again at this map, the dark blue, that's Egypt proper. The light blue is territory that they sort of controlled, but it wasn't officially Egypt. And you can see from the map, Egypt was the power. Egypt was the most powerful empire in this world, in the late Bronze Age. But there were others. In the red here to the north of Egypt, we have the Hittites. The Hittites were another kingdom. They actually expanded beyond this briefly, but this was more or less their borders for most of their history. They were a monarchy ruled by a king, like the pharaoh in Egypt. They emerged around 1600 BC, and they caused a lot of problems for the Egyptians. With their shared border, they fought the Egyptians constantly, and actually the first peace treaty that we have record of is between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Further to the east, here in purple, we have Babylonia. This is more or less where ancient Sumeria was in the old Bronze Age. Babylonia is centered around the city of Babylon, and they took over, like I said, much of what was ancient Sumeria and the south of the Akkadian Empire. They emerged as a power around 1800 BCE under a legendary king called Hammurabi, and they maintained their power for quite a period of time. They were briefly the most powerful power in the region, other than obviously Egypt, but they gradually went on a decline and were eventually eclipsed by the Assyrians, who I'll mention in a minute. But the Babylonians were very advanced for their time, particularly in art, architecture, astronomy, studying the stars, and in medicine. They made lots of medicinal advances. And then to the north of the Babylonians, we have the Assyrians. So at this point in the later Bronze Age, this is the Middle Assyrian Kingdom. This is not Assyria at its most powerful. They're kind of a secondary state to Babylonia and the Hittites and the Egyptians. But the reason they're included here is that they become very important later on. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age civilizations started to collapse, and we don't actually know why. But the thing is, the Assyrians didn't collapse. The Hittites collapsed. The Egyptians went into massive decline and became a very weak state, and were eventually mostly conquered by the Assyrians. The Babylonians were conquered by the Assyrians. The Mycenaeans, who I will speak about in a minute, disappeared. But the Assyrians stayed on in the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire. which was the largest empire in history at that point. But that's later on. And finally, the Mycenaeans. I have coloured them quite lightly on this map because they're different from the other civilizations in that they were not a single kingdom. There was no one king like the Pharaoh or like the king of the Hittites or like Hammurabi for the Babylonians. They were a cultural group, and we don't know much about their systems of government, but they were incredible traders. They had great influence all around this region of the world, and they were famous artists and artisans and architects, and they built amazing palace complexes all over what is now Greece and Anatolia, which is this area here on the map, around the Aegean Sea. Now, other than the Mycenaeans, we're going to leave the Mycenaeans to one side because they're kind of the odd ones out because they were not a centralized government. Other than the Mycenaeans, the Bronze Age civilizations shared a lot of common characteristics. Firstly, bronze. They used bronze tools, bronze weapons. Bronze was the center of their entire economy and society. Without bronze, they would have collapsed. But as well as that, they featured very, very, very centralized governments. The power was incredibly concentrated in the king or the emperor or the pharaoh or whatever, and his ministers, his government. And this meant that they were very effective. They were able to plant crops and harvest effectively. They had very efficient agriculture. They were able to build massive monuments, which we weren't able to repeat again until the classical period. They built huge irrigation systems, which helped to support their advanced agriculture. That means bringing water artificially from rivers to their farms. They created a lot of art, architecture. Of course, they all have in common writing, which we're going to delve into later on in the unit. And of course, war. They fought each other constantly. And the weapon of war that they used was the chariot. So they had infantry, who normally had shields and spears or shields and swords, but the real weapon was the chariots. And these are small wooden vehicles, basically, with 2 horses in front and a man or several men. The different civilizations had different types of chariots on the back, which would attack. And a chariot charge was how they won battles in the later Bronze Age. So that's a brief overview of the Bronze Age civilizations. Like I said, tomorrow we're going to go in depth into the Akkadians, the first empire, and we're going to examine some primary sources about the Akkadians and see what they were like. And later on in the unit, we're going to talk more about particularly Egypt, and then cuneiform, their writing style, and the Bronze Age collapse, when all of these civilizations, except for the Assyrians, just died out without a clear reason why. So that's it for today.